welcome along again. Today we are going to be reviewing some additional lines of evidence for the reliability of the Gospels and Acts, looking in particular at internal lines of evidence. So just to recap on the basic arguments that we're putting forward through this course, we're arguing that there's an avalanche of very cumulative evidence that demonstrates that the Gospels and Acts are based on the testimony of eyewitnesses and that they're substantially trustworthy. And of course, a common objection that one encounters from internet atheists and skeptics is that a demonstration of various mundane events in the Gospels doesn't provide support for the miraculous claims of the Gospels. And there's a sense in which that's true. It doesn't deductively follow that if the mundane matters of the Gospels are accurate, that the supernatural aspects must be as well. However, what it does show is that the Gospels and Acts are composed by individuals who are close up to the facts, well-informed, and habitually scrupulous. And that being the case, we get ourselves to a place where we have to assess why those sources, which seem to be grounded in substantially reliable and truthful eyewitness testimony, are making the sorts of claims that they do concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus. And what best explains that? Is it that the apostles are honestly mistaken? Is it that they're lying? Or is it that Jesus, in fact, did rise from the dead? And so that gives rise to the argument for the resurrection, which we will cover in a future session. If you can make a strong argument for Jesus' divine self-understanding, that also provides the foundation for the trilemma argument. You can also build an argument for messianic prophecy on the basis of gospel reliability, and then also the argument from the conversion of the Apostle Paul, which I'll do a whole session on in due course. And then there's also another couple of arguments that I would adduce that we'll come to in future sessions, the argument from contemporary miracles and the argument from the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds. So let's then come to look at some lines of evidence for the internal, for the reliability of the gospel. So we've looked at undesigned coincidences. We've looked at extra biblical confirmations, both in the gospel accounts as well as in the book of Acts. For these, we've also looked at aspects of difficult local knowledge. Some other lines of evidence, though, include expressive silence, unexplained allusions, the principle of restraint, the criterion of embarrassment, artless similarities, and reconcilable variations. So we've looked at these first three, and so I'm going to focus primarily on the four that are highlighted in red: expressive silence, unexplained allusions, principle of restraint, and criterion of embarrassment. But I do want to give a few bonus undesigned coincidences. I did say in my previous presentations that I'm only giving you a sample, an evidence sampler from these different categories. I'm not being exhaustive, and so to show that there are a lot more where these came from, let me give you a few more examples from both the Gospels and Acts. So here's one concerning Jesus' female disciples. So in Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, we read about certain female disciples that followed Jesus out of Galilee. It says, soon afterward, Jesus went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means. And so we can infer from the previous chapter, in chapter 7, that Jesus and his disciples are in Galilee. Capernaum is, of course, on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And it's also reported that it's also supported that the women are from Galilee because Joanna was the wife of Herod's household manager, and of course Herod was the tetrarch of Galilee. Now, when we turn it over to Mark chapter 14, verses 40 and 41, we read, there were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joses and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Now, notice that those names are given here in Mark 14 overlap only partially with the names given in Luke chapter 8. In Mark and Matthew, the names are Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome. There's no mention here of Joanna or Susanna. Luke 8, though, doesn't mention Mary the mother of James or Salome, who are mentioned here. So it doesn't look at all like Luke added the passage in chapter 8 in order to place the woman earlier in Jesus' ministry and thus fit his narrative together with Matthew and Mark concerning the woman at the cross, because the names are only partially the same. Luke would have presumably included Mary, the mother of James and Salome, and probably left out Susanna if he had fictionalized the verses in chapter 8 on the basis of Mark's mention of the woman at the cross. Luke himself mentions the woman who came from Galilee at the cross and burial in chapter 23, verse 49 and 55, but he doesn't even name any of them there. So both accounts, therefore, confirm apparently independently that there was a group of women who had begun following Jesus in Galilee who continues to do so and who helped Jesus in concrete ways by ministering or providing. But there's more. So in Luke chapter 24, verses 6 through 10, we read, this is what the angels tell the women at the tomb. He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise. And this is the woman who'd come with him from Galilee, according to chapter 23, remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. So this makes it clear that these women really were personally with Jesus in Galilee and heard what he said there. Now, when Luke names various women who brought the disciples news of the empty tomb and the message of the angel in 24 verse 10, he names Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Joanna, and says that there were other women as well. Now, once again, he doesn't seem to be trying to reproduce his own list from chapter 8, because Mary, the mother of James, was not in that list, and Susanna isn't mentioned in 24:10. Nor is he reproducing Mark's list of women at the cross or Mark's list of women who came to the tomb in Mark 16, verse 1. Since Salome isn't included in Luke's list, and Joanna, who's unique to Luke, is not included in Mark's list. So Luke seems to be listing women whom he really knows were present for the events on Easter morning. Evidently, he isn't sure about Susanna's presence, or just for whatever reason doesn't bother to mention her. And he knows that Mary, the mother of James, was there on Easter morning, even though she isn't listed in his chapter 8. So this is actually an example of an undesigned coincidence that's internal to the Gospel of Luke, essentially a way in which fairly distant parts of Luke's own narrative fit together in an apparently casual and non-deliberate way. So Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and various other women were with Jesus in Galilee, and they heard there Jesus' own prediction of his crucifixion and his resurrection. So they subsequently went with him to Jerusalem and were present at the cross, burial, and empty tomb. So that's another example of an undesigned coincidence. Let's look at another one. This one's actually between one of the Gospels and the book of Acts. So in the book of Acts, in chapter 1, we read concerning the decision to replace Judas among the disciples. Of course, Judas betrayed Jesus, and so he has to be replaced. And so in Acts chapter 1, verses 21 and 22, we read that, so one of the men who have accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up from us, one of these men must become with us a witness to his resurrection. And of course, this dovetails quite nicely with what we see in John 15, verses 26 through 27, where Jesus says to the disciples, when the Helper comes, that would be the Holy Spirit, of course, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who proceeds from the Father, he will bear witness about me, and you also will bear witness because you have been with me from the beginning. And so the qualification then for being one of Jesus' apostles is having been with him from the beginning. And so that dovetails with Acts 1, where the disciples are looking for someone to replace Judas, namely someone who meets that qualification as having been with Jesus from the beginning, and so he can be a witness with them to Jesus' resurrection. Okay, here's another example of an undesigned coincidence. This one concerning the book of Acts and its relationship to the letters of Paul. So in Romans chapter 15, 25 through 27, we read, "At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem, for they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings." And so the letter to the Romans, of course, was written at a time when Paul had recently finished gathering a collection for Macedonia and Achaia. And Achaia, of course, is where Corinth is. Corinth is the capital of Achaia. And Paul was planning to go to Jerusalem to deliver the funds that he had collected from those churches. Now, in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, in the first 4 verses, we read, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia, for in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own account, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints." So the letter of 2 Corinthians, this appears to have been written at a time when Paul was in Macedonia, he collected money there, and he was planning to come to Corinth, the capital of Achaia, from there. And he's hoping that the Corinthians will have their portion of the collection ready for him coming. Now, in 2 Corinthians 9, verse 5 verses, we read, "It's superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints, for I know your readiness, for which I boast about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I am sending the brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty in this matter, so that you may be ready, as I said you would be. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead of you and arrange in advance for the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction." So evidently, Paul had bragged to the Corinthians about the Macedonians and their readiness to give. And then he tells them that he'd been bragging to the Macedonians about them, that he plans to bring some Macedonians with him when he comes to Corinth. And he doesn't want the church in Corinth to be embarrassed by not being ready with their collection. And so he urges them to have it ready for him coming. Now, in 2 Corinthians 2, verses 12 and 13, we read, when I came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, even though a door was opened for me in the Lord, my spirit was not at rest, because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I took leave of them and went on to Macedonia." So thus we learned that Paul had traveled to Macedonia from Asia Minor, just as one would expect, given that he started from Ephesus. And Troas, of course, is directly along the overland route from Ephesus to Macedonia. Now, in 1 Corinthians 16, the first 4 verses, we read that concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. So, and then in what follows in that chapter, Paul expresses his intention to go to Macedonia and to come into Achaia, to Corinth from there. And he's also, of course, thinking about the collection in this chapter, 1 Corinthians 16, where he gives specific instructions to the church at Corinth about getting the collection ready, prepared, so that when he arrives, it's not going to be a hasty gathering. So at the time of writing 1 Corinthians, Paul doesn't yet know whether the churches will want him to be responsible for escorting the money to Jerusalem. This point has been settled already by the time that he writes Romans. Now, it turns out that Acts agrees perfectly with this entire order of travel, without mentioning fundraising as the purpose of that journey. In Acts 19, verse 21, Paul sketches out an intended itinerary for himself, traveling from Ephesus overland to Macedonia, from there into Achaia, and from there to Jerusalem. So not only Paul's intentions, but also his actions happen to coincide between the book of Acts and the letters of Paul. So in Acts 20, verse 1, it says that Paul left Ephesus following the riot. He traveled north and west to and through Macedonia, which of course coincides with his passing through Troas, as noted in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 12. And eventually he came down into Greece. He stayed in Greece for 3 months and was planning to leave for Syria. Now in Acts, so here's the text in Acts 20. After the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months. And when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. So we can establish on independent grounds that Paul wrote the first letter to the Corinthians towards the end of his stay in Ephesus, around Acts 19, verse 22. And at that time, he's urging the Corinthians to have their portion of the collection prepared. But now we can say even more. So Paul apparently wrote 2 Corinthians during his time in Macedonia, so roughly Acts 20, verse 2 verses. And the writing of Romans fits perfectly at the end of 3 months in Greece, mentioned in Acts 20, verse 3, likely the winter that Paul spent with the Corinthians when he's getting ready to take the money that he's collected to Jerusalem. Now, all of these placements in Acts are corroborated by clues that relate to the collection that is taking place at this time, which is not mentioned in the book of Acts. We also have learned from this text in Acts 20 that we just read, in the first 3 verses, that due to a plot made against Paul, he had to go to Jerusalem by going back overland. And in Acts 20 and Acts 21, go through that route in detail, and eventually he of course does arrive in Jerusalem, and he meets with the leaders of the Jerusalem church in Acts 21. And of course Paul got taken into custody by the Roman soldiers, and that ultimately led to his imprisonment. And in Acts 24 verse 17, in his defense before the governor Felix, Paul makes this highly indirect allusion to the collection for Jerusalem. He says, "Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings." So William Paley, in his book Horror Paulinae, he summarizes this undesigned coincidence, saying, and I quote, "Hence, therefore, fetched from 3 different writings, we have obtained the several circumstances which the epistle to the Romans brings together, namely, a contribution in Achaia for the Christians at Jerusalem, a contribution in Macedonia for the same, and an approaching journey of St. Paul to Jerusalem. We have these circumstances, each by some hint in the passage or by the date of the writing in which the passage occurs, fixed to a particular time, and we have that time turning out upon examination to be in all the same, namely towards the close of St. Paul's second visit to the peninsula of Greece. This is an instance of conformity beyond the possibility of random writing to produce. I also assert that it is in the highest degree improbable that it should have been the effect of contrivance and design." So here's also another example relating to Acts and the Pauline corpus. So in Romans 15, we read in verses 18 through 20, "For I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience, by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and all the way around to Illyricum, I fulfilled the ministry of the gospel of Christ." So Illyricum was a province to the northwest of Macedonia, and its southern portion is roughly where present-day northern Albania is. And just a few verses later, Paul has told the Roman, goes on to tell the Romans that he hopes to visit Rome and eventually to go to Spain, which is even further west than either Illyricum or Rome. And so it seems that Paul is giving an eastern and northwestern reference point, Jerusalem and Illyricum, indicating roughly the geographical extent of his ministry so far. And that's followed immediately by his intentions to travel even further west to go to visit Rome and Spain. Now, we've already seen that Paul was writing Romans around the time of Acts 20, verse 3. That's when he spends 3 months in Greece. Now, during that same journey, just before the point where we place the writing of Romans, there would indeed have been an opportunity for Paul to have traveled as far northwest as Illyricum. But in his earlier journey, the previous one, recorded in Acts, there isn't such an opportunity. So Acts 20, verse 2 describes the second journey of Paul through Macedonia in general terms, saying, when we had gone through these regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. And literally the Greek here is having exhorted them with much talk. So given the wording concerning Paul's travel and the emphasis on this much talk, it's plausible that Paul traveled around in Macedonia during that time, and he got as far as the northwestern border with Illyricum, which would allow him to list Illyricum as the farthest western limit of his ministry so far in the letter that he wrote shortly thereafter to the church in Rome. Whereas contrast that with Paul's journey through Macedonia on his second missionary trip in Acts 16, verse 9 through Acts 17, verse 5, where there's no such expressions. And so Paul's travel in those chapters is charted, in fact, quite precisely along the eastern edge of Macedonia. The cities are, in fact, listed one by one. The author seems to leave no room for a visit all the way around to Illyricum in his account of that journey through Macedonia. And so William Paley points out that it's quite perfect then to find that there is space for wider travel in the journey recorded briefly in Acts 20, verse 2, just before the writing of Romans. And so it's even more implausible to envision a hypothesis of some sort of deliberate contrivance when we consider the fact that the dating of Romans to Acts 20, verse 3 is an inference from completely other independent indirect evidence. Here's another undesigned coincidence between Acts and Paul's letters. So in Acts 21, 17 through 24, we read that when we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God. And they said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law, and they have been told about you, and that you teach all the Jews who are among Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, so they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. Now, these events transpired shortly after Paul had written Romans. Remember, we dated Romans to Acts 20, verse 3. That's the time. That's where Paul wrote Romans, most plausibly on the timeline given to us in Acts, which we've established on independent grounds to be in the previous chapter, in Acts chapter 20, when Paul spends 3 months in Corinth, in Greece. And so it's quite striking then that this controversy comes up very shortly after Paul wrote the letters to the Romans. And this is a very understandable misunderstanding of Paul's theology in his letter to the Romans. And so what one can understand as one reads Romans how that misunderstanding might have arisen. But the fact that we are able to pinpoint when Paul wrote Romans on independent grounds is another example of an undesigned coincidence between Acts and Paul's letters. Okay, here's another one also regarding the book of Acts. So in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 19, we read, the churches of Asia send your greetings, Aquila and Priscilla, together with the church in their house, send you hearty greetings in the Lord. So we can infer that Aquila and Priscilla were in Ephesus with Paul at the time of his writing. Now in Romans 16, verses 3 through 5, it says, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. Greet also the church in their house. So by the time that Paul writes Romans, he believes that Priscilla and Aquila are in Rome. Okay, so in Romans 15, verse 25, we read, "At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints." So, thus, sometime between the writing of 1 Corinthians and the completion of the collection for the Christians in Jerusalem and the completion of the letter to the Romans, Priscilla and Aquila left Ephesus and traveled to Rome. And so there must have been enough time for Paul to have heard of their arrival in Rome. Now, what does Acts tell us then? So Paul first meets Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth, and he works with them there. And they later instruct Apollos, who is then sent to Corinth and is useful to the Christians there. Acts tells us that they had previously lived in Rome. The book of Acts places them in Ephesus at the end of chapter 18. And it's from there, later in chapter 19, that it seems that Paul wrote the epistle to the Corinthians, in which he conveys their greeting. So Acts doesn't introduce them into the story too late in order for them to be referred to in the greetings in 1 Corinthians, and it places them in Ephesus at approximately the right time. Okay, so that's just a few bonus examples of undesigned coincidences. Let's look then at some other internal lines of evidences for the credibility of the Gospels in Acts. So another feature that I think points to the historical reportage model is the phenomenon of unexplained allusions in the Gospels in Acts. So an unexplained allusion is where you have these dangling loose ends or that play no obvious relevance or to the story. They don't play a part in the story, but they're not explained or clarified or expounded upon or elaborated on in those sources. So an example of this would be in Mark 15:21, where we read, "They compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross." Now, who are Alexander and Rufus? We're not told. They show up nowhere else in Mark's gospel. They're just name dropped, like we're supposed to know who they are. And presumably these were individuals that were known to the original audience. Perhaps they were active in the early Christian community, but they're not known to us today. And so just to name drop those individuals has a ring of verisimilitude or truth likeness. When you're fictionalizing an account, you try to minimize unnecessary details, but to just name drop Alexander and Rufus, who play no further role in the story, is something that seems unlikely if this is fictional, but is not particularly surprising if this is indeed historical reportage. There's also a reference, by the way, to Rufus in Romans chapter 16. And there is early church tradition that suggests that Mark's gospel may have been written in Rome. And so that's interesting. It's plausibly the same Rufus that's in view in the book of Romans, although it's not certain. There could have been other Rufuses that were involved in the early church, but that's an interesting possibility as well. Okay, so in Mark chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, this is another example. It says, it's listing the disciples. It says, "Simon, he's surnamed Peter, and James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, and he surnamed them Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder." Now, why are they called the sons of thunder? We're given no further elaboration or explanation in Mark's gospel. It's an unexplained allusion. It plays no further part in the story. There's no further elaboration as to why they're given that title. There is some suggestion in Luke 9, verses 51 to 55 that we looked at when we covered undesigned coincidences with James and John asking Jesus, "Lord, do you want us to call fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" And Jesus turns and rebukes them to go into another village. But that's Luke's gospel, not in Mark's gospel. So this is an unexplained allusion that I think fits well with the historical reportage model. Here's one in the Gospel of John. So it says, after this, in John 2, verse 12, "After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples and stayed there for a few days." And it just moves on with the story. There's no elaboration as to what happened in Capernaum during those few days. It's just a very off-the-cuff, casual, and artless statement. In John 3, verses 25 and 26, it says, "Now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew over purification. And they came to John and said to him, 'Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing and all are going to him.'" Again, there's no further elaboration or discussion of what that debate or dispute was about between John's disciples and a Jew concerning purification. Again, an unexplained allusion. Here's one in John 12. Among those who went out to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida Galilee, and asked him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. And Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him." And so we're told that there were some Greeks at the Feast of Passover who wanted to speak to Jesus. So they come and ask Philip if they can speak to Jesus, and Philip goes and gets Andrew, and Andrew and Philip go and tell Jesus. But there's no further discussion of what the Greeks wanted to see Jesus about. It just moves on with the story. Jesus answers them along those lines, but he doesn't. We don't know what the Greeks wanted to ask Jesus about in the first place. Here's another one from Luke 13, the first 5 verses. There were some present at that very time who told him about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And he answered them, "Do you think that these Galileans are worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered in this way? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Or those 18 on whom the Tower of Siloam fell and killed them, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others who left in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish." Again, there's no further discussion or elaboration of what this incident was involving the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices, or indeed the Tower of Siloam, etc. Here's another one. This is from Mark 14:58 and Mark 15:29. This is when Jesus, before Caiaphas, at his interrogation, and false witnesses stepped forward saying, "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that's made with hands, and in 3 days I'll build another, not made with hands." And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple or rebuild it in 3 days." Now, nothing in the Synoptic Gospels provides a pretext for this accusation. Of course, as we learned when we did the session on undesigned coincidences in the Gospels, there is a pretext given in John's account, in John chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, where the Jews say, after Jesus has cleansed the temple, "What miraculous sign do you show us to prove your authority to do these things?" And Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll build another." And of course, what we have in Mark and Matthew 26, 60 and 61, and Mark 14, 57, 58, is a garbled version of what Jesus in fact said. He didn't say anything about destroying a man-made temple or rebuilding 3 days, but not by human hands. But that's a pretty serious allegation, right? In the context of first century Judea, that's not the sort of thing that you want to make jokes about. But the reader is just left hanging, wondering, what did Jesus say? Is there any truth to this allegation? But there's no pretext given to us in the Synoptic Gospels. There are also examples of unexplained allusions in the book of Acts. So in Acts 17, verses 14 and 15, for instance, it says the brothers immediately sent Paul. This is after Paul has been in Thessalonica. There's been some Jews that stirred up trouble for him in Thessalonica, so Paul leaves for Berea, and then the Jews from Thessalonica come to Berea and stir up trouble for him there too, so he leaves in haste for Athens in Greece. It says the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. Now notice that in Acts, there's no explanation for why Silas and Timothy remained behind in Berea while Paul leaves in haste for Athens. Now, if you remember when we discussed undesigned coincidences between Acts and the letters of Paul, we looked at how 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 illuminates and sheds light on why Timothy is left behind in Berea. It turns out that he had instructions to return to the church in Thessalonica, because under the circumstances, Paul was concerned for their well-being. So he sends Timothy to go back and check up on them. But that's never explained or clarified in Acts. So that is an example of an unexplained allusion. In Acts 18, verse 18, also, this is one of my favorite in Acts. It says, after this, Paul stayed many days longer, and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria. And with them Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchreae, he cut his hair, for he was under a vow. And they came to Ephesus and just moves on with the story. And the reader's wondering, what's that about? At Cenchreae, cut his hair, for he was under a vow, some sort of Nazirite vow, but there's no further explanation or elaboration in the text. It's just thrown in as a very casual, loose end that tends to support historicity. So that's unexplained allusions. Another pattern of evidence in the Gospels is the phenomenon of expressive silence. So a form of undesignedness can sometimes arise when we examine cases where information is assumed by the author, although not explicitly spelled out. That is, repeated omissions that carry meaning. This is best explained with an example. So where is Joseph in the Gospel accounts? So Jesus, father of Joseph, appears only in the childhood narratives of Matthew and Luke. He's also briefly alluded to in John 1:45, where it says, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And in John 6:42, they said, "Is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, his father and mother we know? How does he now say, I have come down from heaven?" The last we see of Joseph in any narrative is during the trip to Jerusalem when Jesus is 12 years old in Luke chapter 2. Nowhere are we told what happened to Joseph. There is a silent presumption of his death without any positive affirmation of that fact. And of course, this suggests that the authors of the Gospels know something more about the family circumstances than what they've disclosed to us in their report, which fits with the hypothesis of historical reportage, more so than the hypothesis of fiction. But this becomes even more striking when we consider Joseph's conspicuous absence, even when Jesus' family, mother, and brothers are conspicuously present. So, for example, in Mark 3, it says they went home and the crowd gathered again so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, "He is out of his mind." And his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And the crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your brother and your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you." And he answered them, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother." Again, no reference there to Jesus' father. Very striking. In Mark 6, it says, "He went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, 'Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?'" So you'll notice that there's no reference to Jesus' father, even though there is reference to Jesus' mother, brothers, and sisters. John 2, verse 12, again, after this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. Well, where's Jesus' father? John 19:27, this is when Jesus is on the cross. He says, "Then he said to the disciple," this is the disciple whom Jesus loved, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. And one might well wonder, why isn't Joseph taking care of Jesus' mother? In Acts chapter 1, it says, "They returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, the Sabbath day's journey away. And when they had entered, they went up to the upper room where they were staying. Peter and John and James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas and Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus and Simon the Zealot and Judas the son of James. All these with one accord were devoting themselves to prayer together with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers." Well, again, where's Joseph? And so again, it suggests that the authors of the Gospels and Acts know something more about Jesus' family circumstances than what they have disclosed to us in their reportage. And that is very consistent with the idea that they're reporting real history, and they just, for whatever reason, they chose not to tell us what happened to Jesus' father, who's presumably passed away early in Jesus' life. Another line of evidence is the principle of restraint. Now, not once does Jesus address many of the major topics of controversy and debate in the early church, including whether believers had to be circumcised, how to regulate speaking in tongues, what roles were open to women in ministry. And of course, these issues could be settled a lot easier had Jesus had something to say about these topics, and yet Jesus is silent on those hot-button theological topics. And that suggests that the authors felt themselves restrained by what Jesus really had said and taught during his public ministry. They didn't feel at liberty to put words into Jesus' mouth in order to resolve their contemporary theological debates and so forth. This is quite contrary to what you see with Muhammad when it comes to the Hadith literature. Now, relating to this is the phenomenon of authorial asides in the Gospels. This is where the authors give their own interpretation of Jesus' words, but they don't attribute that interpretation to Jesus himself. They don't manufacture sayings of Jesus that gives the author's own interpretation. They're very careful to distinguish what Jesus's words were and what their interpretation of Jesus' words is. And there's a number of examples of this. So, for example, in Mark 7, verses 18 and 19, it says, Jesus said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean." Notice that the author doesn't attribute to Jesus a statement that thereby I declare all foods clean. Rather, he says, this is my interpretation of Jesus' meaning. There's quite a number of those in John's Gospel. So John chapter 2, verses 18 through 22. The Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and will he raise it up in 3 days?" But now it gives the interpretation. But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So again, being careful to distinguish Jesus' words from their own interpretation thereof. John 7, 37 through 39. On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." And now it gives the interpretation. Now this he said about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive, for as yet the Spirit had not been given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. Another example is in John 13, 9 through 11. Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." This is during the foot washing episode at the Last Supper with the disciples. Jesus said to him, "The one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." And now we have the interpretation. For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, "Not all of you are clean." And so Lydia McGrew, in her book, Eye of the Beholder, the Gospel of John's historical reportage, she says, and I quote, "John's repeated careful preservation of the distinction between his interpretive glosses and Jesus' historical words is positive evidence that he is a reliable reporter of Jesus' historical words, not that he considers himself licensed by the Holy Spirit to blur that distinction." Another aspect of the principle of restraint is that none of the Gospels give any details about the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to Peter or the appearance to Jesus' brother James. Now, brief mention of the appearance to Peter is made in Luke 24, 33 through 34. So clearly, Luke is aware that there was such an appearance. It's not that Luke is unaware of it. It says that the Emmaus disciples found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord is risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." And the appearance to Peter is also alluded to in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 5. And the appearance to James is mentioned only in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7. Now, presumably, Peter and James both made it known that they had seen the Lord after the resurrection, but neither, for whatever reason, made an account of the private meeting available for publication. Now, Lydia McGrew concludes, she says, "We can only conjecture exactly how it came about that both James and Peter made it known that they had seen Jesus after his resurrection, but that neither of them made an account of the private meeting available for publication. But withholding the details of such a private conversation is the sort of thing that happens all the time in real life. If the gospel writers were trying truthfully to record only what they either knew directly or had reliable sources to tell them about, they would have very little to say about such meetings, exactly as we find. But if they felt free to invent dialogue and scenes in order to fill in where information was otherwise missing, why would they not have done so here? Their restraint points to the conclusion that they are truthful, reliable recorders. Finally, there's also the criterion of embarrassment. So this is a criterion historians use to as part of or one of the criteria that we use to evaluate historical sources. So an account, the principle behind the criterion of embarrassment is that an account likely to be embarrassing to its author has a high likelihood of being true, because you don't tend to make things up that hurt your cause or make yourself look bad. The author would have no reason to invent an account which might embarrass him or which might be counterproductive to his cause. The disciples are portrayed in the Gospels as being dim-witted. They fail to understand what Jesus is saying on multiple occasions. They are portrayed as uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus not once but twice during his greatest hour of need. They make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. They are rebuked. Peter is called Satan, literally adversary, by Jesus in Mark 8:33. Peter, of course, being one of the leaders of the early church. They are portrayed as cowards. Peter denies Christ 3 times to save his own skin. The disciples run away because they are afraid for their own lives. In fact, the women are the chief discoverers of the empty tomb. And of course, in the patriarchal society that was ancient Israel, the testimony of a woman was worth only a fraction of that of a male witness. And so if you're feeling yourself at liberty to manufacture details, why have women as the chief primary witnesses to the empty tomb? They are also doubters. Despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, the disciples are doubtful when they hear of his resurrection. And some are even doubtful after they see him risen. He's considered out of his mind by his own family who come to seize him and take him home. He's deserted by many of his followers. He's not believed by his own brothers. John 7:5 says not even Jesus' own brothers believed in him, which was pretty scandalous for a rabbi. It's thought to be he's thought to be a deceiver. In John 7:12, he turns off Jewish believers to the point that they want to stone him. He's called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which could easily have been seen as a sexual advance. He's ignorant of the date of his own return. In Mark 13:32 and Matthew 24:36, he says, no one knows the date of the hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And now it's clear that Matthew and Mark both had a high Christology. I think that it's quite clear that Matthew and Mark both affirmed the deity of Christ. And yet, why do they include those statements? In fact, there's a textual variant where the phrase "nor the Son" is actually omitted from some manuscripts because it's embarrassing. Why would they invent that detail had Jesus not in fact said that? But it does create this ascending ladder for or hierarchy, if you will, from men to the angels to the Son to the Father, and so it gives you some window of insight to Jesus' divine self-understanding. He's crucified also despite the fact that anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse, according to Jewish law in Deuteronomy 21:23. In fact, in the 2nd century, Justin Martyr had a dialogue with the Jewish rabbi Trypho, and Trypho says to Justin Martyr, "These and such like scriptures, sir, compel us to wait for he who is Son of Man shall receive from the Ancient of Days the everlasting kingdom. But this so-called Christ of yours was dishonorable and inglorious, so much so the last curse contained the law of God fell on him, for he was crucified." And so the Jews mocked Christians for this belief in a crucified Messiah. And in fact, the Romans also mocked Christians for this belief in a crucified Messiah. There's actually graffiti in Rome where there's a guy that is portrayed as kneeling before a crucified donkey. And the caption on this image is, Alexamenos worships his God. So it was an item of mockery, both from the Jews as well as from the Romans. So in summary then, various lines of internal evidence help to corroborate many details found in the gospel accounts. And cumulatively, the evidence suggests that the gospel authors are indeed close up to the facts and habitually reliable, and adds even further reason to think that's the case beyond what we've already considered in previous sessions. And of course, this is only the pinnacle of the proverbial iceberg. And so if you want some more reading on all of those points, I recommend those books as a good starting place. Lydia McGrew's 3 books, Hidden in Plain View, The Mirror or the Mask, and The Eye of the Beholder, as well as Peter J. Williams' book, Can We Trust the Gospels? Thanks for your attention. Happy to entertain any questions.